Jesus in India, the Lost and Missing Years. First became interested in this subject, and a Facebook friend posted this on his Facebook page, a BBC documentary. Jesus was a Buddhist monk named Isa who spent 16 plus years in India and Tibet. From this enlightenedconsciousness.com website. Intrigued me since I have an interest in studying world religions. Started doing some research on the subject, bought books, a number of books you can find actually written on this. Jesus lived in India. When Jesus lived in India. Jesus in India, it's written by an Ahmadiyya Muslim. The Fifth Gospel, a man named Fida Hasnain. The evidence from the Tibetan, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and Urdu sources about the historical life of Jesus Christ after the crucifixion. Jesus, the explosive story of the 30 lost years in the ancient mystery religions by Tricia McCannon. Of course, if you go on YouTube, you'll find as well a number of videos on the subject. Jesus in India by a man named Edward T. Martin. National Geographic has a video on the missing years of Jesus. And here's a book I found very helpful called The Lost Years of Jesus, documentary evidence of Jesus' 17-year journey to the East by a lady by the name of Elizabeth Clare Prophet. She's no longer living, passed away in 2009, but she had married a man by the name of Mark L. Prophet, who in 1963 founded an organization called the Summit Lighthouse. He supposedly had a gifting to be able to contact what's called the Ascended Masters and receive dictations from them. So they relay to him this special knowledge. He'd write what they told him down, and that's what became part of his teachings. And then Elizabeth Clare Prophet married him, and I guess she said to have had this gifting and received dictations as well from these ascended masters who basically run the gamut from Jesus Christ, the Buddha, Kuan Yin, Kali, Merlin. A number of people were these ascended masters, and in 1975 she founded her organization called the Church Universal and Triumphant. Here's the meta-narrative of people who believe this sort of worldview that Jesus had gone to India. And so it's based on the Eastern philosophy. So it goes like this, that basically we all have the flame of life, or they call it the spark of divinity. Miss Prophet also calls it the violet flame. That's within us, just like the Buddha, Jesus, and these other ascended masters. So they are just simply people like you and me who have re-entered the consciousness of God, or the I Am presence in us. That's what the term Miss Prophet like to use. So like the Ascended Masters, we too can realize our I Am presence. And of course you realize this through studying with people, such as Miss Prophet and her husband, and others who have received this esoteric knowledge that most people don't have, and they can guide you through the steps you need to go to basically become one with the ultimate reality. So the flow goes like this. They'll say Jesus was just a man, just like you and I. He eventually became Jesus the Christ. He reached this state of Christ consciousness and ultimately the I Am realization that he's one and the same with this ultimate reality. They'll call it by a number of names. Same thing with Siddhartha Gautama, who's born in Lumbini, Nepal. Eventually became the Buddha after meditating under the Bodhi tree. Became enlightened and reached the state of nirvana. And then this God realization. So a man named Alexander Smith, in a book he wrote called The Holiest Lie Ever, said this about Jesus, that he was not the Christ or Son of God. Jesus was a man. He had a few main motives. One was that he planned to establish his own ministry and exert influence by using the teachings and knowledge he had acquired from the ancient masters and mystery schools of the East and Egypt. And Jesus even planned his own death precisely when he intended it to be. So they'll say Jesus had gone and studied in the East among Hindu gurus and Tibetan Buddhist monks, absorbed all this knowledge and information, became enlightened, achieved this Christ consciousness stage. And when he went back to Israel, that's affected his teachings, and they'll look at various verses in the New Testament and reinterpret those according to this Eastern worldview. So let's get into some of the people that you'll hear about. I guess basically there'll be three people whose names will come up about actually having seen what's called the Isa manuscript. The first one is a Russian by the name of Nicholas Notovich, born in Crimea in 1858, of Jewish descent, but he was of the Russian Orthodox faith. He was a journalist, fluent in Russian and French, it seemed, and wrote about Russian affairs of state. Miss Prophet talks about him in her book. It says, Notovich is something of an enigma. According to the National Union Catalog, he wrote 11 books. Yet there is almost no biographical information available about him. Apparently we know even less about him than we know about Jesus. So this is what he's known for, this book here on the right-hand side, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. So it was a book he wrote, like a travel diary. He'd gone traveling throughout Asia and the Orient. See, this is a table of contents from the book. So he had journeyed into Tibet, this Ladakh region in northern India. He attended a feast at the Hymnist Monastery that we'll talk further about. And this section that's highlighted is supposedly translations of this Tibetan manuscript he came across at the Hymnist Monastery that talked about Jesus being there in Asia and the Orient. So he visited India in 1887, and then he had visited the Hymnist Monastery. So he had while he was traveling through, I believe it was Tibet or northern India, he had gone to another Tibetan monastery and learned about somebody named Isa, or that's the name that Jesus is called in that area. Had been there, and that intrigued him, so he set out to see if he could try to find further information about it. He heard there were some Tibetan documents on the subject. So he went to this Hymnist Monastery, talked to the head lama there about looking at any manuscripts that they may have that talked about Jesus, but the head lama looked for the manuscripts, couldn't find them, told him to come back later. So he left the Hymnist Monastery, but as fate would have it, his horse stumbled. In his book, he said he was thrown from his horse, fell, broke his leg. So the closest place to return was back to the Hymnist Monastery, so he was taken back there. And lo and behold, the head lama was able to find some manuscripts that talked about Isa, showed them to Nicholas Notovich, and then he translated portions of those into a notebook. And that's what's captured here in this section, the life of Saint Isa. Second person you hear about is a Hindu man by the name of Swami Abed Ananda. He was born about 8 years after Nicholas Notovich, the disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. And he was sent to New York in 1897 to head the Vedanta Society by a guru by the name of Swami Vivekananda, who is known for speaking at the Parliament of World Religions at the end of the 1800s in Chicago. And he's basically credited with bringing Eastern thought and Hinduism to the United States. So he read Nicholas Notovich's book and was so intrigued by it that in 1992 he actually traveled to the Hymnist Monastery. He said he was shown a manuscript and also translated portions of that into a book he wrote called Swami Abedananda's Journey into Kashmir and Tibet. Third person you'll hear about is another Russian man by the name of Nicholas Roerich. He's a painter, writer, theosophist. He has some really nice paintings. So if you Google his name and just type in Nicholas Roerich paintings, you can take a look at those. Really talented. But interesting, in 1925, his wife, his son George, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and 6 friends went on a 5-year-long expedition throughout Asia. Just think about trekking through that part of the world in 1925. So they'd gone through the Punjab, Kashmir, the Ladakh region, Mongolia, Tibet, detoured through Siberia to Moscow. So this is one of the books he wrote called Altai-Himalaya Travel Diary, which described his journeys throughout the Orient. Pretty interesting reading. So here's a map of the area where the story is going to unfold. So we're going to be in the northern part of India up here. Here's it zoomed in. We'll be in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. And here's the Ladakh region, and I believe the Hymnist Monastery is located somewhere up in here. So just to give you a frame of reference, Pakistan is over here to the right. Going up, there's Afghanistan. To the north, going over to the east, there's China, and then going down to the southeast, that'll be Tibet. So this area of Ladakh, where the Hymnist Monastery is located, it means the land of the high passes, and it's made up of 3 groups of people. There's Tibetan Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims that inhabit that area. So here's a picture of the Hymnist Monastery, and you can just tell by the type of terrain, it's very rugged and mountainous. I guess this rustic scenic beauty. And here's a picture of the Silk Road, because this is going to be how people will say Jesus left Israel and went over to India. And here there's a green, one of the main routes of the Silk Road, and there's these other feeder routes that branch off of it. So it traverses all the way over through China into Korea, and then all the way over to Japan, and then to the west into Europe. So let's get into some details about Nicholas Notovich. He said to have visited Hymnist in 1887, and here's some quotes from his book. He says that he, or the head Lama, brought me 2 big books, the large leaves of which were of paper yellow with age, and from them read to me the biography of Isa, which I carefully transcribed in my traveling notebook according to the translation made by the interpreter. This curious document is compiled under the form of isolated verses, which, as placed, very often had no apparent connection with or relation to each other. Again, he reiterates there were 2 manuscripts from which the Lama of the convent Hymnist read to me, all that had a bearing upon Jesus. The details concerning Jesus, given in these chronicles, are disconnected and mingled with accounts of other contemporaneous events to which they bear no relation. So I hope you're getting the idea. He goes on to say that I have arranged all the fragments concerning the life of Isa in chronological order in which they were absolutely lacking. And I have had the patience to join these verses, the one to another, arranging them in consecutive order to form sense and deducing from them what forms my translation. So I hope you get the idea. He was shown these 2 large books that talked about the life of Isa, but the parts that talked about Isa were scattered throughout these 2 big books that he had to arrange himself in chronological order because they were lacking that. He said join the verses together, and that's what formed his translation that he wrote in his notebook and later published. And in his book, as I showed earlier, the unknown life of Jesus Christ, that's captured in here, this section, the life of Saint Isa, which interestingly came out to be 14 chapters in his book. So everything that he compiled in his notebook came out to comprise 14 chapters that he wrote in his book, and that's going to be key to remember. As we talk about Swami Abed Ananda, who visited the Hymnist Monastery in 1922, this is what he says in his book. It's written in the 3rd person because when he got back to India, he had somebody help him transcribe what was in his notebook into his book. But it says, the Lama took a manuscript from the shelf and showed it to the Swami. So now there's just a single manuscript. He said that it was an exact translation of the original manuscript, which was lying in the monastery of Maribor near Lhasa. It consists of 14 chapters and 224 couplets or slokas. The Swami got some portion of the manuscript translated with the help of the Lama attending on him. So this is what the Swami captured in his book, but interesting point to observe. He said the single manuscript he was shown consisted of 14 chapters. So it seems the Swami had found an already compiled single manuscript containing 14 chapters that talked about Isa. That's interesting. That's the same number of chapters that Nicholas Notovich had in the section of his book that he had transcribed. Some may say this is a different book that was shown to Nicholas Notovich, but it seems highly coincidental to me that it had the same number of chapters as that Nicholas Notovich compiled and published in his book. So as I was doing more research on this and reading other books on the subject by other writers, there's some discrepancies that started surfacing. One of them is, what language did Nicholas Notovich have transcribed the manuscript into his notebook, or was translated into? Because in Nicholas Notovich's book, I was able to obtain 3 versions of it. He did not say, he just said he recorded what was in the Tibetan manuscript. But the Swami, in his book, said it was recorded, he wrote it in Russian. Elizabeth Keller Prophet said English, and another person we'll talk about, Abed George Burke, said it was Russian as well. There's also some discrepancies about who translated the manuscript for the Swami. In his book, he said it was by the Lama. In Abed George Burke, in his book, online book, said it's by the Lama. But in a video that I watched by a man named Edward T. Martin here, he said in an interview that was on the video that the Swami knew the language and can translate it himself. And then a lady by the name of Carol Lamb, in her book Jesus Chronicles, said it was translated by expert interpreters. And to me, kind of the most damning discrepancy is how long Nicholas Notovich stayed at the Hymnist Monastery after he had fallen and broken his leg. If you read his book, he either says 2 to 3 days, or in one publishing it was a few days, and I believe this is just due to the translation, because the book he published was originally came out in French, so it would have had been translated into English. So I'm assuming the translation into English, one person translated from the French to 2 to 3 days, one just said it was a few days. But interesting, the Swami in his book said he had convalesced at the Hymnist Monastery for a month and a half or 6 weeks. A man named Paul Van Ooyen, in a book he wrote titled Jesus' Forgotten Years in India and Tibet, the Gospel of St. Isa, said Notovich stayed at the Hymnist Monastery for some time. I believe this should be actually Tricia McCannon, not McCammon. But in a book she wrote, said Notovich had stayed there for many months. Edward T. Martin, again in the video that I referenced earlier, said he was there for some weeks. And Carol Lamb, in her book, said he stayed at Hymnist until he was able to walk. That's quite a range of time periods. But if you read Nicholas Notovich's book, he actually said that he was able to arrange some porters in a litter to carry him out from the Hymnist Monastery after 2 to 3 days. So he didn't stay there until he was able to walk. So this really should cause people some concern, because if people are writing books about this subject and there's discrepant information such as this, it calls into question what other information in the books that they're writing that may not be factual, because it's fairly simple to go back to the main source, which is Nicholas Notovich himself, and read this information about how long he was actually at the Hymnist Monastery. So the third person is another Russian by the name of Nicholas Roerich. I believe around 1925 or so, he said had visited Hymnist. But if you read his book, he talks a lot about hearing legends, as he says here, legends about the Christ life existing in Asia. He talks about a group called the Nestorians, which we'll talk about, a sect of Christianity. He talks about apocryphal legends, some more talking about the Nestorian Apocrypha, legends and manuscripts. But so I showed the book Himalaya. That's the first book I'd read by Nicholas Roerich, but I could find nowhere in the book that he mentioned actually being shown Tibetan manuscripts about Jesus or even translating them. But interestingly, his book does have similar verses about Jesus to those found in Nicholas Notovich's book, but it's not obvious where these came from. So Elizabeth Clare Prophet talks about this in her book and mentions another book by Nicholas Roerich called Himalaya Monograph. And in her book, she says the following, that he, Roerich, did however find evidence of the Isa manuscripts, although he does not specify whether the text he later published were copied there, referring to Hymnist. He may have found the manuscripts at Hymnist, some other monastery in Ladakh, or possibly even in Sikkim, and a good portion of his text is parallel to 60 of those verses, he says, were published by Nicholas Notovich. So I hadn't heard about this Himalaya monograph, did some searching online, found out it's like an oversized, rare book that's really only obtainable at like university libraries and places like that. So fortunately, I was on a trip to Charlotte, North Carolina, and was able to visit the University of North Carolina Charlotte Library. They had a copy of this book in their rare special collection area of rare books. So I was able to take a look at it, take some pictures, and read through it. So here's just the front cover of the book, and inside, Nicholas Roerich Himalaya Monograph. Here's an entrance to the J. Murray Atkins Library on the university campus. But even in this book, Nicholas Roerich, I can never find where he stated that he actually saw manuscripts about Jesus. So it brings up some questions. Did he actually see and translate the manuscript, or maybe did he copy them from Nicholas Notovich's book? But reading through these two books and others by him and his son George, we can definitely ascertain with certainty that the people he met traveling through Asia believed the legends about Isa, and that there were manuscripts that existed about him. So in trying to do some more digging about Nicholas Roerich actually seeing this Isa manuscript, I came across this website by a man named Abed George Burke, who goes by also the name of Swami Nirmalananda Giri. So his website is titled Original Christianity and Original Yoga, Light of the Spirit Monastery, the Atma Jyoti Ashram. He has an online book about called the Ladakh Manuscript, I believe, that talks about this. So in this online book, he says the following. Later, Dr. Nicholas Roerich, the renowned scholar, philosopher, explorer, also was shown the manuscript. And then he wrote about his own viewing of the scrolls in his book, The Heart of Asia. So I was intrigued, because I hadn't read this book, so I was able to obtain a copy and read through it. But after I read this, I'd sent an email to Abed George Burke asking, hey, where the reference that you wrote about from the Heart of Asia, where was that? Because I read through the book and couldn't find it. Then his reply was, well, where I found the statement about Roerich, I do not remember, but fortunately I just came across an important article you will find interesting. I'll use this to correct what I've written in the book. So he provided me a link to an online article, but it didn't say that Nicholas Roerich actually saw the manuscript or even translate it. So I was able to come across another article in this Interpersonal Journal of Transpersonal Studies titled Did Jesus Go to India by Mr. Rosen. So he says in this article that amazingly, with no connection to Notovich and Abed Ananda, he, Nicholas Roerich, came upon the Isa manuscript And what's more, his son George, who happened to be traveling with him, they both read the manuscript firsthand, took notes, and recorded it in their travel diary. So this was pretty intriguing. I thought, well, maybe I'll actually find some accurate information here. And then he had some footnotes to 2 books. One was The Heart of Asia that I mentioned earlier, and the second one, Trails to Inmost Asia, written by George Roerich. There were no page numbers referenced, so I was able to track down the Trails to Inmost Asia book. But as you might guess, nowhere in those 2 books, or any of the books that I've read so far by George Roerich or his son, Nicholas and his son George, mention reading the Isa manuscripts firsthand or translating them. So here's The Heart of Asia, Himalaya Monograph, Altai Himalaya, and Trails to Inmost Asia by George Roerich. So just a little bit about George Roerich. He was definitely the man to have on the trip with you. Miss Prophet says this about him, that he was a noted archaeologist and Orientalist, trained at Harvard in the School of Oriental Languages in Paris. He had studied Persian, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan. So he was, like I said, definitely the person to have with you, because if they found this Tibetan manuscript about Isa, he could read it firsthand. But it was interesting that in the book The Heart of Asia, Nicholas Roerich did write about being shown some sacred books. But it was when he visited this Bon Po monastery, which is like the indigenous kind of tribal religion in Tibet and in that region, and that it was proposed to George that he read them. So that's interesting. He did write about this in his book, but nothing is stated similarly concerning the Isa manuscripts at Hymnist or elsewhere. And since the books he wrote were travel diaries documenting their trips, and seeing the Isa manuscript, let alone translating it, would be a highlight to definitely record. It was done with the Bon Po books, but for some reason there's no mention of it. So you may be asking, well, were any photographs taken of this manuscript? And the only one that I could ascertain, there were 2 women who had visited Hymnist, Miss Gasquet and Kaspari. I believe it was supposed to be a picture of the head librarian at the Hymnist Monastery showing them some parchment saying that this talks about your Isa, or Jesus, was here. But it's you can't read what's on it, so this is really of no value. Nicholas Notovich, in his book, did mention that he had taken photographs, but when he had arrived in Bombay, they were quote-unquote obliterated and useless. And then Swami Abed Ananda, interestingly enough, has some photos that he took and put in his book, but there are no pictures of the manuscripts, which seems a little odd, because that was really the motivation for him taking the trip to Hymnist. So maybe there could be another slant on this. What about some motives of the monks regarding this Isa legend in these manuscripts? So I came across a website by an actual Tibetan Buddhist monk named Bhante Dhammika. I believe he was an Australian man, but he actually became an official Tibetan Buddhist monk, and has written a number of books about Tibetan Buddhism. But he describes in an article, and I guess he also doesn't believe Jesus actually had gone to India. But in an article he wrote, he said that in 1989 he actually stayed at the Hymnist Monastery as a guest of the senior monk. Then he asked him about the Jesus story, and he says, the senior monk groaned, rolled his eyes upward, and told me that Westerners often come to the monastery and ask about Jesus, and that some of the younger monks string them along for both fun and profit, mainly for profit. So here's a Tibetan Buddhist monk being told by another Tibetan monk. Now there's nothing to this story. It's basically the younger monks having fun with people and trying to get money out of them. So you need to ask, why would one Tibetan Buddhist monk lie to another about this? I don't see what the motive would be. And even Nicholas Roerich has some unpleasant things to say about the Hymnist Monastery. He writes this in his book, Himalaya Monograph. The Lamas are half literate, and our guide laughs, and he says, Hymnist, a big name, but a little monastery. Of course, small, not according to size, but to inner meaning. And Roerich writes, here's apparent prejudice and greed. So Nicholas Roerich saw something while he was at Hymnist that caused him to write such a fairly unfavorable description of the monastery, and uses the word greed. So I was able to find this table that lists, so as I mentioned earlier, Nicholas Notovich had compiled verses from the Tibetan Isa manuscript into 14 chapters in his book, and this is here how they kind of fall out in the Swami's book and Nicholas Roerich's book. So I left this out, but in another book I'd read by a man named James Lewis called Legitimating Motives, he goes into some discussion on why these verses were in Nicholas Roerich's book. And he had pointed something out that I hadn't seen before, and we'll talk about another document called the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ, but Nicholas Roerich quotes verses out of that document, but never tells the reader where he had gotten them from, which is kind of interesting. And then Mr. Lewis said he did the same thing with the verses from Nicholas Notovich's book. And if you read Nicholas Roerich, seems like he had a not so favorable opinion. As I mentioned, he was in the earlier chart, he was a theosophist. So he didn't have really a high or good opinion of Orthodox Christianity. So I believe that factored into his bias in wanting to try to show some credibility for this Isa manuscript. So what are some details about the manuscript? In chapter 4, it starts off talking about Isa. It mentions that when he was 13 years old, the age at which an Israelite is expected to marry. Jumping down to verse 12, then Isa secretly absented himself from his father's house, left Jerusalem, and in a train of merchants journeyed toward the Sind, with the object of perfecting himself in the knowledge of the Word of God and the study of the laws of the great Buddhas. Then if you read a little further into chapter 5 and some other verses from chapters 7 and 8, Jesus is then recorded as saying the following against the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Hindu scriptures, and the Persian Zoroastrians. So just a little background on the Hindu caste system. There are 4 groups in the caste system. The Brahmins are at the top. They're the priestly caste who perform some of the Vedic rituals and stuff you read about in the Vedas and even now. So there's then below them are the Kshatriyas, which are the warriors of the ruling class. Then below them is a group called the Vaishyas. They're the merchants or shopkeepers. And then the last group below them are called the Shudras. They're the servants to these top 3 castes. Then there's a group of people below these 4 called the outcasts that you've probably heard about. So they're not even in the caste system. They're referred to also as the Dalits, and I believe Gandhi referred to them as the Hadijin, or the children of God. So in chapter 5 of this Isa manuscript, this is what is recorded about sayings of Isa. It says, but Isa, disregarding their words, referring to the words of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, these 2 highest groups in the caste system, he remained with the Shudras, the bottom caste group of the 4. In Isa, preaching against the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. So it appeared Jesus had some issue with the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, because if you read a little bit further, and even some Hindu documents, writings, the Brahmins use their high position to basically keep the lower groups in submission to them. It also goes on to say that Isa denied the divine inspiration of the Vedas and the Puranas. And so these are, the Vedas and Puranas are 2 Hindu scriptures. They have a number of different scriptures, but the Vedas are the oldest and probably considered by many to be the most sacred or revered. Puranas were written later than the Vedas, but here Jesus it's said that he denied the divine inspiration of these Hindu documents, scriptures. It also says Isa denied the Trimurti. This is the Hindu Trinity, or the three main gods of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So Isa denied this, as well as the incarnation of Parabrahma in Vishnu, Shiva, and other gods. Isa is quoted as cited as saying, "Pray not to idols, for they cannot hear you. Hearken not to the Vedas, where the truth is altered." So here again, he's speaking negatively against the sacred Hindu Vedas. Then in chapters 7 and 8, when he's traveling back to Israel, he runs across a group of pagans and the Persian Zoroastrians, and he is said to have said that your people held in the darkness of error by your pernicious doctrines and religious ceremonies. Your doctrine is a fruit of your error. So they don't have the truth. And he says, in seeking to bring near to you the God of truth by creating for yourself false gods. So these are pretty damning sayings of Jesus recorded in the Isa document that it appears a lot of people don't really talk much about or ignore. But Miss Prophet does mention this in her book, and she says the following about this: that the reader ought to consider the possibility that the verses which denounce the Vedas may have been inserted by Nanavali himself. But then, rightly so, she goes on to say, we have no proof whatsoever for this conjecture, only the appreciation of Jesus' vast mind and his ability to comprehend the Trimurti of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But then I'd come across another article that had a different conjecture than that of Mrs. Prophet. It basically said that the Buddhist monks or lamas who compiled the manuscript inserted those verses that spoke negatively about Hinduism and the Hindu scriptures. So it brings up the question, well, which theory or conjecture is it? And it really calls into question now what actually in this Isa manuscript is true and what is not true. Could parts of it have been inserted by Nicholas Nanavali? Could parts have been inserted by the Buddhist lamas? It really calls into question the credibility of the whole document itself. I think there's a third conjecture that could be made, and maybe the simple and plain answer could be that Jesus, based on his vast mind and ability, same terms that Miss Prophet used, to comprehend the Trimurti after studying the Vedas, saw they were false, along with the caste system that benefited the Brahmins and Kshatriyas. So if you read further in the Isa manuscript, it talks about Jesus eventually returning to Israel, and the story plays out pretty much as recorded in the New Testament Gospels, but there's a couple of twists. In the New Testament Gospels, it's the Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees, the priests, elders. They're the ones who want Jesus crucified, and Pontius Pilate, who they take Jesus before with the trial, he finds no guilt with Jesus and symbolically washes his hands of any blood that may be shed. But if you read the Isa manuscript, it's just the opposite. It's the Jewish religious leaders, Pharisees, and the priests who basically say Jesus is innocent. And it's Pontius Pilate who wants Jesus crucified, and he even bribes a witness to speak against Jesus. He's eventually found guilty and crucified. So now let's even some little more skeptical information about this Isa manuscript. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier, Nicholas Roerich in his book mentioned this group called the Nestorians a number of times. And this is from his book, where he says that whoever doubts too completely that such legends about the Christ life exist in Asia probably does not realize what an immense influence the Nestorians have had in all parts of Asia, and how many so-called apocryphal legends they spread in the most ancient times. So just a little bit about the Nestorians. They were founded by a European monk who resided near Antioch named Nestorius. but he was declared a heretic by the church in 430 CE, was banished to a monastery in Egypt, and later moved to Arabia, and then fled further to Persia. He founded the Nestorian church, and by the end of the 10th century, it had spread across the Muslim world to China, India, and Central Asia. And if you read George Roerich's book, Trails to Inmost Asia, he describes when he was trekking through the area in a real remote area, that he came across this cross just out in the middle of nowhere. And he said this is a remnant of the Nestorian Christians who were to be found all over that region. So it's possible that the Nestorian Christians who had lived there spoke a lot about Jesus or Isa. Knowledge about him and legends started spreading, and then were eventually recorded by the Tibetan Buddhists in their manuscripts. So just a summary of what I've talked about so far in the evidence, that really giving the benefit of the doubt to Nicholas Notovich and Swami Abed Ananda. They were really the only two people who saw this manuscript, and as talked about earlier, their descriptions contradict each other. Nicholas Notovich said he was shown two big books with verses about Jesus scattered throughout them that he had to compile, arrange in chronological order, that made up 14 chapters in the book he eventually wrote. Whereas Swami Abed Ananda said he was shown a single manuscript that was consisting of 14 chapters that talked about Isa. I don't have time to go through. There's a number of other people who you'll read about who supposedly were told or heard about this Isa manuscript. They never saw it or translated it, but they'll attest that they heard about it, which really doesn't offer any credible evidence. But there are two people who were opponents of Nicholas Notovich actually seeing and translating this Tibetan document. One was Max Mueller, who was a pretty well-known professor of Oriental Studies. I believe he was fluent in Sanskrit and some other Oriental languages. And he basically said Nicholas Notovich didn't actually see and translate this document. And another person by the name of Archibald Douglas, who's a professor in Accra, in University of Accra, if I remember, in India. So he actually visited the Hymnist Monastery, as is shown here, in 1896, talked to the head Lama there, who would have been the same one at the time that Nicholas Notovich visited Hymnist. And he actually got the Lama to basically sign a notarized document saying that there was no Russian who had visited the monastery and had stayed there because he had broken his leg, or was shown any documents that talked about Jesus being there. So that just contradicts what Nicholas Notovich wrote about in his book, and Miss Prophet discussed that in her book and said, those two testimonies basically nullified each other. But I guess she goes on to believe the account because she talks further. Well, there's the evidence by Swami Abed Ananda and Nicholas Roerich, and she goes on to talk about some of these other people, but as I mentioned, they actually never saw the manuscript. They were just told about it, which is hearsay, offers no credible testimony. So just kind of a breakdown that the evidence shown so far offers no credible testimony of the truthfulness of the manuscripts. And there's no way to confirm when the manuscripts were written. If you read Nicholas Notovich's book, he makes a statement that they were written, I'm trying to remember, like maybe several years after the crucifixion event, that some people on this caravan, they happened to be in Israel at the time of the crucifixion, and when they traveled back to India and the Orient, they brought stories about having witnessed or heard about the crucifixion, but that's all based on Nicholas Notovich's testimony and what he wrote in his book. We'd have to actually see the manuscripts and examine them for ourselves to really come up with some definitive date on when they were written. As I mentioned earlier, the number of manuscripts seen is not consistent. The single manuscript supposedly seen by Swami Abed Ananda had 14 chapters as compiled by Nicholas Notovich from 2 large books. No manuscript is currently known to exist, or maybe I should say available for scholarly examination. The region around India and Tibet is known for numerous myths and legends about Isa and other Buddhas. I didn't discuss this, but if you read, I came across this in Elizabeth Clare Prophet's book, but in Nicholas Notovich's book, he actually visited another monastery before Hymnist, talked to one of the head lamas there, and he mentioned to Nicholas Notovich, we just don't have these manuscripts that only talk about Isa. There have been hundreds of other Buddhas who had existed, and we have also manuscripts that talk about them as well. So Jesus isn't an isolated case. As I mentioned earlier in the story, and Christians were known in the region and along trade routes. Stories of Jesus spread by these Nestorians could easily have been incorporated into legends and written down in the manuscripts. Muslims are also known to inhabit the area and could have spread legends about Isa that were recorded by the Tibetan Buddhists. One of the persons that were in that list that I showed earlier, they had visited the Hymnist Monastery and were told by the head lama that hey, Jesus actually stayed here for a while, and Bhante Dhammika talks about that. In his article, he said that Hymnist wasn't really established till 1672, so there's no way Isa could have been there. Some other research, I think it may have been actually established in the 11th century and then reestablished in 1672, but that still would have been hundreds of years after Jesus lived. And some people may probably say or argue, well, there wasn't a formal monastery there, but maybe there was some location that could be considered Hymnist. It seems, I'm not sure. So here's a question that needs to be asked. You're on trial, convicted of murder, facing the death penalty. So, and this is a type of information that I've just presented that is offered against you. You're waiting for the jury's verdict. They come back and say, we find the defendant not guilty. Are you going to then say, I object. Convict me. I am guilty. The evidence is overwhelming. An honest person would have to answer no. So besides this Isa manuscript that I think I've shown really has no really credible evidence to consider it viable, you'll hear about some other documents. One's called this Bhavishya Purana. So it's one of a number of these Hindu Puranas, and it's one of the 18 major ones, so it's not an insignificant Purana. There's more than 18 Puranas, but this is considered one of the major ones. The title named Bhavishya means future, Purana means history, so it's like a foretelling of the future, and it talks about this Indian king named Shalivahan, who's while trekking through the mountains comes across a man with a golden complexion and clothes that were white. And so this king asks this man, who are you, sir? And he responds, you should know that I am Ishaputra, the son of God. He replied blissfully, and am born of a virgin. My name became Isha, Masiha, Jesus the Messiah. So this document is supposedly another piece of corroborating evidence that talks about Jesus being in India and Asia. If you read this book by Alan Jacobs, When Jesus Lived in India, he says the following about this Purana, that it's believed had been written sometime between the 3rd and 7th centuries A.D., although this Dr. Hosnane, who wrote that book I showed earlier titled The Fifth Gospel, believes it may have been written as early as AD 25. And then in Dr. Hosnane says in his book that this Purana is one of the most important and independent original sources of information about the visit of Jesus to Kashmir. Information provided, though very brief, is historically important. So he considers it a significant document. But if you read further, Alan Jacobs says in his book that we may regard its evidence of Jesus being in India as possibly unreliable, as this addition to the main Puranic corpus may have been made to substantiate the whole case for Jesus having been actually in India well after the actual date. So again, we are in the realm of supposition. Then I came across an article in a website by this man named Stephen Knapp, which is he's pretty important in my opinion because he's actually a follower of Hinduism or Eastern religion. He's written numerous books and articles, on the subjects. So this is what he says about the Bhavishya Purana. He said this prophecy of Jesus is found in no other Puranas, which often corroborate each other. So to find the story of Isha Mashiach in no other Purana sends a red flag of warning. There are presently 4 known editions of this Bhavishya Purana, each having different predictions from the other, but suspiciously having one consistent prediction, and that of Jesus or Isha. And due to these circumstances, it is difficult to ascertain which of the 4 is the original text of the Purana, if indeed an original text still exists. And here's some of the more damning evidence. Since none of the 4 editions of the Bhavishya Purana actually predate British rule in India, which is like the mid-1800s, this further suggests a discrepancy, since, remember, this Purana, Bhavishya Purana, is supposed to be a foretelling of the future. So it would have been foretelling about this king, Shalivahan, meeting Isa. But the earliest copies we have of it are around the mid-1800s. So maybe they were written then, and if that's the case, they weren't actually prophecy. So for example, at the very outset of the description of Jesus meeting the king, this section is fraught with historical inaccuracies. So here's not someone hostile or biased toward wanting to believe this. He's actually a follower of Hinduism. He has some negative things to say about this Bhavishya Purana, so there's really no substantive credibility to it. You may hear about another document called this Nanavali Sutra. So it basically talks about Isha Natha, which is another name for Jesus or Isa, and it says that he came to India at the age of 14, and he talks about when he returns to Israel, he's going to the crucifixion, treated badly by the Jews there, and it says after the crucifixion, or perhaps even before it, Isha Natha entered Samadhi, or this trance-like state by means of yoga. So that's how a number of people will say that he actually survived the crucifixion. He appeared that he had died, but later was able to be resuscitated, roll the stone away from the tomb, and then trek again over to Asia in the east and is buried in a tomb in Kashmir. But this sutra also talks about the guru that Isha Natha had named Chitanatha, and it tells the story that while he was in meditation in the lower reaches of the Himalayas, he saw a vision of Isha Natha because of the crucifixion, being tortured. So it says he subsequently made his body lighter than air and passed over to the land of Israel. He took the body of Isha Natha to the sacred land of the Aryans. Interesting. I wonder how that happened. And Fida Hasnain, in his book, The Fifth Gospel, mentions about this sutra, and he said that this establishes survival of Jesus on the cross in his departure towards the east. And based on this, I wouldn't place any credibility into this sutra, as well as what we saw about the Bhavishya Purana. You may hear there are some documents in an archive at this Jagannath Puri temple in India that spoke of Jesus actually staying there. So I came across an article titled Pros and Cons of Jesus in India. It was an interview with the Shankaracharya of this Puri temple. And he says that, yes, it's true. I've studied ancient records in the Puri Jagannath temple archives confirming these facts about Jesus being in India. He was known as Isha, and during part of his time in India, he stayed in the Jagannath temple. So here's a picture of the Jagannath temple. So doing some more research, I came across this newsletter, the Sri Krishna Kathamrita Bindu, which is published by the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, or as they're known, the Hare Krishna sect of Hinduism. You can see here they had an article that talked about this Aquarian Gospel, which I'll get to shortly, and Jesus in Jagannath Puri. So this is what this article said, that this account seems to be based on an edition of a history book of the Jagannath Mandir in Puri called the Mada Apanji, the Drum Chronicle. In general, scholars and learned sadhus are dubious of the authenticity of at least some of the accounts in it. So here we have the Hare Krishna group, a sect of hidden Hinduism, calling into question the authenticity of some parts of, this document at the Jagannath Puri temple. But even if the document states Jesus was there, I think it'd be hard to determine or confirm the validity of what is written in it, or that it was simply a myth or a legend or fact. I guess we'd have to be shown the manuscript and have it scrutinized. So the last document I'm going to talk about is called this Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ. So it talks about Jesus not just being in India and Tibet, but Persia, Assyria, Greece, and even Egypt. But interestingly, it's not based on conventional sources of information such as eyewitness accounts or even hearsay. But it's written by a man named Levi Dowling, who claimed to have realized this gospel during a series of meditative experiences that he had. So he basically had a special gift that few people have. He says that he recorded it from a non-physical plane of existence that he referred to as the Akashic Records. So these records are a compendium of all human events, thoughts, words, emotions, and even intents ever to have occurred in the past, the present, or future. So I hope you get the gist. So it's something that he can't go read with his eyes and see. I guess it came through him during some meditative state. And he was able to record what's supposedly written in these records, and that's what he wrote in his book, The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. I came across the website by another mystic named Edgar Casey, who also supposedly had been able to read these Akashic Records, and he says the following: the Akashic Records, or the Book of Life, can be equated to the universe's supercomputer system. It is this system that acts as a central storehouse of all information for every individual who has ever lived upon the earth. So supposedly they had tapped into the parts of this Akashic record that talked about Jesus, his past life, and recorded him being in India, Tibet, and these other places. So you may hear the term Akashic Record. It's used interchangeably with the Book of Life and also the Book of Remembrance. These two terms you'll read about in the Bible. But interesting, when you read writings of people who believe and have this type of worldview, they'll quote often from the Bible, but your interpretation will just be 180 degrees opposed to what the normal orthodox interpretation is. So a man by the name of Ron Rhodes wrote an article titled "The Jesus of the New Age Movement" says this about Edgar Casey and Levi Dowling, that allegedly they obtained their revelations by reading this Akashic record, yet their readings blatantly contradict each other. Not only do the accounts disagree with each other, they all disagree with the gospel accounts in the New Testament. And the New Testament has solid, irrefutable manuscript evidence, which is a true fact. But interestingly, this Aquarian Gospel that was written by Levi Dowling wasn't published until 1908, so it's not a document of antiquity. So you may be asking, well, what does the Bible actually say about these so-called lost, silent, missing years of Jesus from the age of roughly 13 to 30? The Bible is relatively silent in this regard. It's really one of the four Gospels. The Gospel of Luke is really the only one that talks about this. So it starts in chapter 2 of the Gospel of Luke, verse 41 through 52. I won't read this, but it basically talks about when Jesus was 12 years old, he went to Jerusalem with his parents to attend the Passover festival, as was their custom. As they were leaving, it appeared they had gone with some other relatives and a number of other people. As they had left, they noticed Jesus wasn't with them, and they couldn't find him after a day's travel. So they returned to Jerusalem looking for him, and then it says after 3 days they found him in the temple court, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. And then it goes on to say that then Jesus, went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And in verse 52 it says, and Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So just a little bit about this word translated stature. It's used in a number of other translations as well. I guess in Greek, it's the Greek word helikia, which means can mean the age or a time or length of life, so a time period. Adult age, maturity is like in years of maturity. So given that definition, we can read it as Jesus grew in wisdom and in maturity, or in years of maturity, or in his length of life. So based on this Greek definition, I believe it's reasonable to infer that this is saying Jesus went back to Nazareth with his parents, grew in wisdom, and remained in Nazareth for quite a long period of time, a number of years where he grew in maturity. So he did not go to India and then return. So if you read further in Luke chapter 3, it goes into mentioning that Jesus, about 30 years old, began his ministry. So it starts his ministry, and then in chapter 4 it describes Jesus going to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue. It says, as was his custom. So it seems pretty unusual and doesn't really make sense that if Jesus left at around the age of 12, he'd been gone 17 odd years and then returned, there's no way he could have established a custom of going into the synagogue on the Sabbath and standing up to read. That doesn't make sense. This is just another verse in the Gospel of Luke that lends credence that he stayed in Nazareth during this time. In Luke chapter 4, it mentions that Jesus was talking to some other people and then says that they were going to tell him that do here, I think about doing miracles, do here in your hometown, which we have heard you did in Capernaum. So he mentions the word his hometown, which was Nazareth. That seems to offer some more evidence that he was actually there and had a hometown that he stayed in for a time period. Then in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, some people are talking about Jesus, and they make the statement about him that, isn't this the carpenter? So this would be really odd that, again, he had left around the age of 12 and been gone for 17 years or so. Now he's in his ministry, comes back, and they're referring to him as the carpenter. That wouldn't make sense because he would have been gone. And I guess in some other research, I believe this word in Greek that's translated carpenter here can actually refer to some other trades of working with your hands, not just carpentry work, but some other type of work as well. So in other verses in the Gospel of John, for example, Jesus makes a statement a number of times talking about his hour had not yet come, or his time had not yet come. So this gives evidence that his main purpose for coming to earth was not to record every single detail of his life from birth to the start of his ministry. So these so-called missing years weren't something important or critical to actually document, because what's important is what happened after he started his ministry at the age of 30. This seems to give credence to that. And then lastly, in this verse in the Gospel of Mark that I read earlier that it mentioned about, isn't this the carpenter? It also says that, isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and his sisters here with us? It's interesting that it doesn't mention his father Joseph in this list, just Mary and his siblings. So I think we can infer that his father Joseph had passed away, and from what I've read, he was most likely older than Mary. Had passed away at this time, and now being the oldest, Jesus would have had to have taken care of his mother Mary and his siblings, so that's why he would have been staying in Nazareth as his hometown during this period, and nothing's recorded about it, because also, as mentioned earlier, that wasn't main part of his ministry. So just a little bit about the reliability of the New Testament. As far as number of manuscripts and like the time frame between when they were written in the manuscript that we do have, I think it's not controversial that the New Testament stands head and shoulders above any other ancient document in the number of manuscripts that we have and the time interval between when the original was written and the extant copies that we have. So just for example, taking Homer's Iliad, written around 900 BC, the earliest copy we have is from 400 BC. That's a time span of 500 years. There's roughly about 643 manuscripts of the Iliad. Some of these other ancient documents of antiquity by Suetonius, Tacitus, Thucydides, written as the dates shown here. The earliest copy we have, 900, 1100 AD, which gives a time span of anywhere from 800 to 1300 years removed from when they were written. And they have a small number of manuscripts. But most people don't seem to have any concern or call into question the historicity or validity of any of these documents. And when we go to the New Testament, written around 40 to 100 AD, interesting, Miss Prophet agrees with this date range in her book. The earliest manuscript copy we have is 125 AD. That gives a time span of 25 to 50 years. Even if you go to the 2nd and 3rd century, that'll just give you a couple hundred years, which is still better than these other documents. And we have, this number is inaccurate, I believe over 25,000 manuscript copies or actual manuscripts now of the New Testament. Everything else pales in comparison. So even if we didn't have these 25,000 or so manuscripts to refer to, we can actually recreate, I believe it's up to 95% of the New Testament just from the writings or quotations of the New Testament from the writings of the early church fathers. Here's just a listing of some of those. So that's another reference point. And New Testament manuscripts can actually be viewed online at this website, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. So they're not being hidden away like these Tibetan Buddhist manuscripts. They're available for believers, non-believers, anybody to review and scrutinize. Here's the website link. So if the Buddhist monks would do something similarly, maybe we can find some more information about the use of manuscripts. Some documents I've read, people try to make excuses, saying the monks they don't trust foreigners. They may steal the manuscripts, so they don't want to show them to anybody, but that, to me, that's just making excuses, because they did show the manuscripts to certain foreigners. So let's compare so far what we've come across as far as these documents. As far as the Isa manuscript, I'm not really sure we can say with certainty when it was actually written. Some people you read about will say that they were written not long after the crucifixion event, but since we actually don't have any to examine, that's just speculation. You don't know when the earliest copy, the time span, and how many of them there are. This Bhavishya Purana, from what I've read, people throwing out dates that run the gamut. So the earliest copy that this Stephen Knapp mentioned that we have is from the time around the British rule in India, around 1850 AD. So that would give this time span of thousands of years. He said we have only 4 manuscripts that contradict each other, don't have any credibility to them. It's not the Nanavali Sutra, from what I could ascertain, was written maybe 250 BC. That's questionable. No idea when the earliest copy is versus the time span and how many of them there are. This Drum Chronicle that's supposed to talk about Jesus being at this Jagannath Puri temple. Couldn't find any information about when that was supposedly written. Again, the earliest extant copy, the time gap, and how many documents there are. I didn't put the Koran Gospel of Jesus Christ on here because it's not a document from antiquity. As I mentioned earlier, it was actually published in 1908, if I remember. Fairly recent. And then compare all of these to the New Testament. Again, written between 40 and 100 AD, over 25,000 manuscripts to actually available to review and scrutinize and to assess. So again, I think somebody needs to ask themselves this question honestly, that if you were on trial facing the death penalty, this is the type of evidence that is offered against you that's shown for Isa being in India from these documents that I've shown. Would you say, convict me, I'm guilty? I believe an honest person would have to answer no. So there's some closing thoughts. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, at an epilogue of her book, sort of opines about why you suppose that the vast majority of people in the West are unfamiliar with this theory, so why they accepted in the East that Jesus Christ, the avatar of the Piscean Age, went to India and Tibet during the so-called lost years. She also mentions that there's supposedly 63 manuscripts that talk about Isa in the Vatican Library that are being held and not released because the Pope and the other people there in the Vatican don't want it released, because once people will find out the truth, they'll be all distraught and in an uproar. I guess there's scant evidence for that. And so I think the simple and obvious answer is that unless you're biased to believe this theory, the evidence as shown and that's out there is severely scant. As I mentioned earlier, is of the nature, if one is honest, would not want evidence of a similar nature to convict him of guilt in a court of law. So I originally had this in the presentation, to talk a little bit about confirmation bias, but it made the presentation too long. I'll probably do another video on that. But I think, if you're living in that region, area, as Elizabeth Clare Prophet says, steeped in this kind of mysticism, I think, naturally we all have biases. I have biases. Everyone has biases. They would want to believe such a story because that would lend credence to how Jesus became so enlightened in his teachings, and he became that way by studying with these Hindu gurus and Tibetan monks, and so that's why when he returned to Israel and started teaching, that his teachings were just so astonished people with his wisdom. And so you can actually do your own research, and I think if you're open and honest about it, will come to the same conclusion that I came to.